Good day. The last few hours, the last day or so, may become important when the history of the Ukrainian crisis is written, because the admissions that are starting to appear in the Western media, which finally acknowledge the reality, which is that Ukraine is losing the war, and that the war in Ukraine is, in fact, if the present trajectory holds, likely to be lost. And there have been two important articles to that effect, one in the United States, in the Wall Street Journal, another in the Spectator, which is in Britain, an important magazine and news magazine in Britain. I'm going to touch on what is said in each of these articles, but I'm going to suggest that even whilst they make important admissions about the reality of the situation in Ukraine, the fact that the military situation is deteriorating, the fact that in effect Ukraine is losing and has arguably actually lost the war, they show no ability or understanding about what needs to be done next. There is no practical plan, no real idea about how to move forward. Let's turn first to the article in the Wall Street Journal, and it's an article which has been written by Eugene Rummer, who I understand is a former US intelligence officer, or at least somebody who has worked in intelligence. And I'm not going to read the entire article because it is behind a paywall, but it begins with the devastating headline: "It's time to end magical thinking about Russia's defeat." Magical thinking. In other words, wishful thinking. Wishful thinking that has prevailed all the time since at least 2021, arguably before then, about Russian capabilities, Russian resilience, the stability of Russia's political system, the political strength of its leadership. Anyway, this is how the article begins. It says that as President Putin looks towards the second anniversary of his all-out assault on Ukraine, his self-confidence is hard to miss. A much-anticipated Ukrainian counteroffensive has not achieved the breakthrough that would give Kiev a strong hand to negotiate. Tumult in the Middle East dominates the headlines. Bipartisan support for the Ukraine in the United States has been upended by polarization. Putin has reason to believe the time is on his side. Up the front line, there is no indication that Russia is losing what has become a war of attrition. Note the interesting formulation here. No indication that Russia is losing. Rather than straightforwardly say that Russia is winning, we have no indication that Russia is losing. It's expressed as a negative. No indication that Russia is losing, as against a positive. Russia is winning. And it then goes on to say what has become a war of attrition. The Russian economy has been buffeted, but is not in tatters. Putin's hold on power was, paradoxically, strengthened following Prigozhin's failed rebellion in June. Popular support for the war remains solid, and elite backing for Putin has not fractured. Western officials' promises of reinvigorating their own defense industries have collided with bureaucratic and supply chain bottlenecks. In fact, it's much more complicated than that, as Brian Beletic, Alex Vashinin, myself and various others have pointed out. And then the article goes on to say, meanwhile, sanctions and export controls have impeded Putin's war effort far less than expected. Russian defense factories are ramping up their output, and Soviet legacy factories are outperforming Western factories when it comes to much needed items like artillery shells. The last must be a bitter admission, by the way. The technocrats responsible for running the Russian economy have proved themselves resilient, adaptable, and resourceful. Elevated oil prices, driven in part by close cooperation with Saudi Arabia, are refilling state coffers. Ukraine, by contrast, depends heavily on infusions of Western cash. Putin can also look at his foreign policy record with satisfaction. His investment in key relationships has paid off. China and India have provided an important backstop for the Russian economy by ramping up imports of Russian oil and other commodities. Instead of fretting about lost markets in Europe or Beijing's reluctance to flout US and EU sanctions, Putin has decided that it's more advantageous in the short term to become China's junior partner in the economic realm. Well, that's a sour point, one which I'm not going to discuss beyond that. But then anyway, he goes on to say, this article goes on to say, even neighbouring countries that have every reason to fear Putin's aggressive tactics, such as Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, have made fat profits by serving as enablers of sanctions circumvention and as transshipment points for the goods that Russia used to import directly. And the article then goes on to say that the warrant from the ICC has not impressed the global south. The Ukraine war holds little salience for these countries who bristle as they perceive US and European double standards. And then the article goes on to say that none of this should be a surprise. In other words, failure on every count. The sanctions have failed. Russia has not been defeated on the battlefield. It is not losing. In other words, it is winning. And this is a war of attrition, which of course works to Russia's advantage. And the article then goes on to say that there should be no expectations that this situation is going to change any time soon. This state of affairs poses an unprecedented challenge for Western leaders. Washington and its allies have been effective at tackling the most urgent aspects of the problem, staving off Ukraine's collapse. Well, that's debatable, but they conspicuously haven't done what they conspicuously haven't done is level with their publics about the enduring nature of the threat from an emboldened revisionist Russia. They have indulged all too often in magical thinking, betting on sanctions, a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, transfer of new types of weapons to force the Kremlin to come to the negotiating table, or they have hoped to see Putin overthrown in a palace coup. And none of that has worked, and now is therefore the time to transition to a long-term strategy that increases and sustains the pressure on the rogue regime in the Kremlin. Now, note that long-term strategies don't include anything to address the problems in Ukraine itself, about which, by the way, this article in the Wall Street Journal has astonishingly little to say. But I'm going to come to that in a moment. But anyway, a bleak picture overall. Putin is not going to be overthrown. There's not going to be regime change in Moscow. The Russian economy is not going to collapse. The Russian army is not going to be defeated. In fact, it is on a trajectory towards victory, as one suspects the author of this article quietly understands. Russia has not been diplomatically isolated. China and India are buying Russian oil and providing Russia with imports, the imports of goods that China needs. The Russians, Putin, are here to stay, and in effect in Ukraine they are winning. And magical thinking, it is magical thinking to start thinking otherwise. A rather devastating view of Western prospects and of Ukraine's prospects coming from the Wall Street Journal, which, by the way, has been guilty of an awful lot of the magical thinking that this article accuses others of. Anyway, that is the article in the Wall Street Journal. And we've now also had an article in The Spectator. And this, by the way, this article is written by Svetlana Moronets, a Ukrainian journalist. But again, it is actually deeply pessimistic about the situation. It says the counteroffensive is nearly over, having made crushingly few gains. Western support is waning. Kiev needs to be honest about how the war is going and what it will take to turn the tide. And the article goes on to say weapons do arrive, but too few and too late. The long-range missiles and tanks being received now would have been useful last year. When Ukraine innovates, as it did with its swarming drones, Russia simply copies, but at scale. And the optimism that Zelensky has projected about the war up to this point is unsustainable. Zelensky has become a victim over the hype, over the counteroffensive. Too many people expected a breakthrough when winter ended and the fighting season began. And the Ukrainians expected that after the offensive began, within 4 months they would reach in Crimea, fight in Crimea, and return, as Zaluzhny put it. This is Zaluzhny's interview with The Economist. But then the troops got mired in minefields in the east and the south. After 5 months of bloody fighting, Ukraine advanced only 10 miles. And expectations have therefore turned to disillusion. And optimism is one thing, but a Panglossian refusal to face hard facts is quite another, and dangerous too. There is now a gulf between the understanding sentiment on the front lines. The soldiers are exhausted. The units are becoming understaffed. The soldiers I talked to, this is what Moronets is saying, in the Donetsk region told me their brigades were so understaffed that they were not allowed home. Some had been in the battlefield for 18 or even 20 months. Others had spent more time at war than at home since 2014. Last week, families protested in a dozen cities across the country, calling for a rotation in the troops and for demobilization after 18 months of service. One kid was holding a sign. It read, "It's my turn to hug my father every day." And there are few replacements for the fallen and wounded. The days of people queuing at recruitment offices are long gone. And the article, I'm going to say, its solution to this problem is to engage in this massive, across-the-board mobilization of everybody who's left. The Ukrainian authorities avoid unpopular topics, as do the Western allies. Kiev and Washington may discuss the war without embellishment in private, but not in public, and do not explain to the world why this war is so hard to win and why Ukraine needs to continue to be given help anyway. And there should be no shame in acknowledging the truth. Ukraine faces an enemy with superior weaponry, technology, and manpower. The West needs to be honest with Ukraine too. And then there's a reference to Colonel Marcus Reisner of the Austrian army, who says that we in the West became victims of our own propaganda. We thought it, the counteroffensive in other words, would work. We have forgotten about the essence of war, which is a bizarre statement coming from a military officer, by the way, but there we go. He said that the article then quotes Reisner as saying that the time has come to draw a line under the summer counteroffensive and to concentrate on bolstering Ukraine's preparation for another attempt at an offensive in the spring. The West must give Ukraine all the weapons it needs without restrictions or accept that victory is impossible. Then we need to tell the Ukrainians this and perhaps start negotiations. In that case, we must admit that the Ukrainian state in its current form may cease to exist because Russia will destroy it. So the solution, supposedly, that at least Mironets is coming up with, mass mobilization, sweeping the cities of any men and presumably women who haven't yet served in the army, drafting all the students, all the young people who are left, getting them to join the army, and the West supplying Ukraine with every conceivable weapon that Ukraine needs. That's what Marcus Reisner says. No explanation about where these weapons are going to come from. We've already seen that the United States is short of shells. We've seen that the European Union has fallen short in providing shells. We saw that the article in the Wall Street Journal admitted that Russian factories are outproducing Western factories in terms of weapons production. But nonetheless, more magical thinking, at least from Mironets, and I am sorry to say Marcus Reisner. Draft more men. Don't worry about training them, presumably. They have to be ready to fight by the spring, which gives only a few weeks to train them to the point when they would be ready to fight. But, draft them anyway. Don't worry too much about issues like training, and supply them with every piece of equipment the West has without acknowledging the fact that there are, in reality, limits to what the West can supply, and that with the Russians not only outproducing the West in critical weapons categories at the moment, but able to concentrate all their resources on the war, this is a losing strategy. It simply cannot work. If the ability to supply Ukraine with weapons was all that was needed, the war would have been won by now. The reason that Ukraine has not received all the weapons it wanted is because there are supply limits that simply cannot be overcome at the wave of a hand. But anyway, that's a discussion that I've said many times, made many times, a point I've made many times. I'm not going to canvass it again. Note, no suggestion from Mironets that there should be a negotiated outcome to the war. In fact, she actually rejects that. She says that Reisner is quite right to rule out a third option of a peace deal. Well, I thought he actually suggested negotiations. Anyway, and she said that is in any sense stable or guarantees Ukrainian sovereignty. That was the deal that Kiev signed in the Budapest Memorandum, which later turned out to be an exercise in appeasing Russian insecurities at the expense of Ukraine. To push Ukraine into a peace deal with Russia that would mean it being partly taken over would guarantee more war to come. It would also demonstrate to the world that the post-war notion of borders being protected by treaties is no longer viable. Whoever has the biggest army can take what he will. Now, there are so many points there which I would dispute that I'm not going to spend my time going over every point that Mironovets makes. I think that she's misrepresenting the Bucharest memorandum, and I think she's also very, very seriously overlooking history. If borders were indeed sacrosanct in the way that people say, we would not have had wars in many places and changes of borders. Yugoslavia presumably would still exist. South Sudan would not be independent. Kosovo would not be recognized by the Western powers as independent also. The reality is that in many cases it is indeed those who have the biggest army who decide these matters. But as I said, I'm not going to go over all of that in more detail. We see that in this article in The Spectator, there is a great deal of magical thinking still. The idea that you can mobilize more men. You don't need to think about how to train them. Throw them into the battle in a few weeks' time, and that will change the situation. You can conjure up more weapons and give them to Ukraine. No real debate about how to train Ukrainians to use these weapons when they even exist. The time needed to do that. You just give them to Ukraine, and that somehow will solve the problem. More magical thinking, in other words, from the article in The Spectator. And going back to that article in the Wall Street Journal, even as it criticizes magical thinking, it engages in it itself. It talks about returning to the US policy of the Cold War era, the policy of containment, which is regularly attributed to the US diplomat and academic George Kennan, ignoring the fact that Kennan's own views evolved over time, and he himself often said that his original articles and telegrams about containment had been misunderstood. But anyway, the article talks about a policy of containment would mean continuing Western sanctions, which have been, the article itself has admitted, have been unsuccessful. Isolating Russia diplomatically, which the article itself admits has been unsuccessful. Preventing the Kremlin from interfering in our domestic politics. What evidence is there, realistically? What actual real evidence is there that the Kremlin has successfully interfered in Western domestic politics? Where has that happened? The big example most often cited in recent years was the Russiagate scandal in the United States. Multiple investigations by the FBI's own Inspector General, Mr. Horowitz, by Mr. Mueller, by John Durham, have essentially discredited that theory, even though there's been little acknowledgement of that. But anyway, preventing the Kremlin from interfering in our domestic politics, strengthening NATO deterrence and NATO defense capabilities. Are we seriously expected to believe that that has not already happened? that NATO deterrence and defence capabilities are actually open to doubt, and then talks about sustained US-European reinvestment in our own defence industrial base. Well, of course, that could in theory be done, but it would be very difficult and expensive to do, a fact that many people perhaps don't fully understand. It would go against the whole trend of Western economic policy and the evolution of Western economies since the end of the Cold War, which has seen Western countries increasingly deindustrialize and move to economies that are based on financing and services. And of course, the sanctions policies that have been applied in Europe, the sanctions policies that have been applied in Europe against Russia, have actually, if anything, accelerated those trends. So it would mean a historic reversal of all of that, and that might be extremely difficult to do. And of course, it would probably result in cutbacks in various welfare programs at a time when budgets are already coming under strain across Europe and in the United States, when debt to GDP ratios are all but out of control. It's a very problematic thing to do. And besides, it would also have another knock-on effect, which is perhaps not widely acknowledged, which is that if the West starts converting such manufacturing as it has left to weapons production, then of course it becomes more difficult for the West to compete in manufacturing against Far Eastern producers, notably, of course, China, who have a much bigger manufacturing industries to start with, and who would no doubt go on to fill even further the gap left by the West. That is, by the way, partly what happened in the 1960s, when during the Vietnam War, the United States transferred more and more of its factories, more of its manufacturing to producing weapons, and as a result ended up facing increasing budget and trade deficits, which in the end undermined the entire Bretton Woods system that had been created following the Cold War. I should say that we have just done a program on the Duran, Glenn Deason and I, with Michael Hudson, the economist, Dr. Michael Hudson, the economist, in which he talks about this and points out that studies that he has done have shown that the entire US trade deficit for many decades was entirely the product of military spending. So, just saying, easier said than something to do, reinvesting in the defense industrial base. And then it goes on to talk about, this article goes on to talk about mitigating the damage, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, caused by Putin's war. What does that even mean? What does that actually mean? Mitigating what damage and how? What diplomatic, informational, military, and economic damage does this article actually mean? And then the article goes on to say, this is the one in the Wall Street Journal, this is not to say that we should fight the Cold War all over again, but surely that is exactly what the writer of this article is proposing. Embarking on a global competition with the Kremlin would not be a wise investment of US prestige and resources. It would consign us to a pointless game of whack-a-mole against any and all manifestations of Russian influence, Putin's Russia has little of the hard power or ideological appeal that made the Soviet Union so influential in various parts of the world. But the article has admitted that the Russians actually do have influence in many parts of the world. They've got the support of China and Russia. They've won the sympathy of the global south. The article sneers about the fact that NATO has welcomed new members, but Russia supposedly is reduced to knocking on the doors of places like Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang. But we've seen that China is itself now a global superpower, and it's not to be disregarded. Iran is, of course, a powerful state, so in its own way is North Korea. And, of course, it isn't just those countries with which the Russians are now on good terms. They hosted an Africa summit a few months ago. They seem to have good relations with many African countries. They have good relations with the ASEAN states, many of the ASEAN states. They're part of the BRICS group, which is expanding. It's absurd to speak of a policy of containment against Russia, and though the author of the article talks about Russia having little of the hard power, presumably the military power, that the Soviet Union did, he acknowledges that the Russians are not losing. In other words, that they are winning in Ukraine. And he says that they don't have the ideological appeal that the Soviet Union did. Well, that may be true, but of course, the fact that they're not the Soviet Union anymore means that they can forge friendly and good relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, whose work with the Russians in controlling oil prices, the author of this article acknowledges. They can forge relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia, with Colombia, which for the Soviet Union were out of reach. So, he is engaging, so it seems to me, in magical thinking of his own. He's talking about a Cold War containment policy, which, whilst at the same time saying that the United States should not allow itself to be drawn into a Cold War. And he's talking about a containment policy, which, with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, he effectively admits the Russians have already negated. About what to do about the conflict in Ukraine, he has really very little to say. He talks about the Ukrainians having successfully withstood the Russian assault up to now. Well, so they have, but given that the Russians are not losing, how long can that continue for? And he says that it's no less crucial to help Ukraine to navigate towards its rightful place in Europe. But of course, all that does is perpetuate the war in Ukraine, which, as the article admits, the Russians are not losing. They are, in other words, winning. It seems to me that even as the author of this article decries magical thinking on the part of Western leaders, he admits, he indulges himself in lots of magical thinking as well. There is no admission in this article of the decisive changes that have taken place in the world, of the way in which US power relative to the rest of the world has waned, a containment policy that might have been notionally successful against the Soviet Union in 1950 is not practical for the United States today. The United States is not the colossus that bestrode the world that it was in 1950. And this failure to acknowledge that fact, which I suspect for the author of this article is emotional, he finds it impossible to admit to the extent to which American power has diminished, negates ultimately his entire argument, even as he acknowledges truths about the situation in Ukraine, which perhaps he has not acknowledged before, and which, as he correctly says, other Western commentators and Ukrainian leaders and Western leaders also refuse to acknowledge. We are in a very bleak situation in international relations. The war in Ukraine is not at a stalemate. It is not being won. It cannot be won. Both of these articles, each in their own way, acknowledge and admit that it is being lost. The article in The Spectator calls for increasingly desperate measures to try to turn the situation round, desperate measures which, in Ukraine's case, would make its situation still worse, sacrificing tens of thousands more of Ukrainian lives, throwing untrained or badly trained or poorly trained young men into battle against an increasingly powerful and professional and technologically advanced Russian army. And in the case of the article in the Wall Street Journal, as I said, withdrawing into magical thinking of its own. The one thing neither author is prepared to do is to actually address the question of a real negotiation that might actually provide for a sustainable peace in Europe and which might enable Ukraine to survive. Markus Reisner, the Austrian officer, talks about the need for negotiations, which he must surely know as a military man, that it is impossible, impractical for the West to provide Ukraine with the weapons that he thinks it needs, and certainly not in the time that would be necessary. So negotiations, and of course negotiations as a result of being delayed and probably will never happen, and as Reisner in effect admits, that calls into question the entire existence, the future existence of Ukraine's state. So there we are, gradual admissions of emerging defeat, but no real plan, no diplomatic strategy to reverse that outcome. Now, I have to say, I have been deeply struck and in some ways depressed by the outcome of the negotiations that took place on Wednesday between President Putin, President Xi rather, and President Biden. I'm going to discuss that summit meeting in a little more detail later in this program. But what I will say is this: it became very clear to me in the hours after I made my video, the one that was published yesterday, it's become increasingly clear to me that no real negotiation, no real substantive discussions took place over the course of that meeting, despite the fact that the meeting between Xi and Biden lasted 4 hours. And it's also become increasingly clear that the United States is not really in a position to conduct negotiations at the present time. The president himself, I think, is no longer capable of conducting such negotiations. We've done a long program about this, Alex Christopher and I, on the Duran, in which I discuss the problems that the president has in conducting negotiations. And I don't want to return to that topic in this program. And the point is that given that the Americans and the Chinese, who have still a relationship with each other that is just about holding together, given that the Americans and the Chinese find it so difficult to discuss substantive issues, given that the president himself appears to find it impossible to discuss these substantive issues with the Chinese, how is he and other officials in his administration going to discuss substantive matters with President Putin? I think a summit meeting between Putin and Biden, which, in an ideal world might be the way out of this problem, is conceptually impossible now. Not just because it would be an almost impossible sell, politically speaking, in the United States. It would be impossible because I don't think the president has the ability any longer to conduct such a negotiation with someone like Putin. I think he would be completely outmatched, and I think his officials know this, and I think that they would never allow him into any kind of situation where he engaged in a negotiation of that sort. Given that a negotiation is impossible between the Americans and the Russians at that kind of level, how can the Europeans conduct a negotiation like that, given the absence of an American lead? How could, say, President Macron, the only European leader who's ever attempted negotiations with the Russians, even though the negotiations he has engaged in have always amounted to less than he has claimed, how could Macron negotiate with Putin purportedly on Europe's behalf or America's behalf, given that America cannot conduct negotiations? He would be worried that any deal that he did with the Russians, or thought he had done with the Russians, wouldn't stick, simply because the Americans weren't behind it. And the Russians must know that, and they must know, in effect, that any real prospect of negotiations now is completely ephemeral. The Ukrainians can't conduct negotiations, neither can the Americans, nor can anyone else. So, the outcome of this conflict is now going to be decided on the battlefield. There is no other way, and it is to the situation on the battlefield that I will now turn. Now, there's been a huge cascade of news coming out of the Ukrainian battlefronts over the last couple of hours, and I'm going to summarize them in this way. In every part of the battlefronts, the parts that really matter, the Russians are now on the attack, and they are continuing to make progress. And perhaps the most interesting place where they're making progress, the most important place, continues to be Avdeyevka, this heavy fortified line that we've been hearing so much about over so many weeks. The Russians made significant advances in the Avdeyevka area back in March and April, before the Ukrainians launched their offensive. They captured the important village of Krasnogorovka at that time. That changed the military dynamics in the Avdeyevka area when they resumed their offensive in the Avdeyevka area in October, their possession, their control over Krasnogorovka has made it possible for them to begin this creeping encirclement of Avdeyevka. And that continues. And in fact, from what I can tell, the trend is actually accelerating. Now, a couple of days ago, in a video, I covered a report from El País by a Spanish journalist discussing a terrible situation for the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka. And I mentioned the fact that this particular journalist was writing from a village called Ocheretino, which is behind the Ukrainian front lines. Well, over the last couple of hours, couple of days, the Russians have been gradually advancing towards Ocheretino itself. I'm not saying that they are quite there yet, but they are coming within distance of Ocheretino. This even as they remain strongly positioned, having made their advance in Stepnoye, they've occupied at least, well, they've pushed the Ukrainians out of that particular village. They're apparently now also shelling Berdichi, which lies just beyond it. And they're also making further advances further south near the waste heap. They're steadily encroaching on the factory, creeping ever closer towards the remaining roads that lead into Avdeyevka from there. And even as they're doing that, the Russians are also pushing from the south. They've now occupied perhaps 60, others say 50% of the industrial zone in the south. We see the pincers around Avdeyevka closing. And the reports suggest that the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka themselves, largely infantry now, increasingly short of artillery cover, no longer equipped with armoured vehicles to any real extent. Anyway, this infantry in Avdeyevka is being redeployed from Avdeyevka itself to try to resist the pressure from the pincers, these two pincers, even as they close on the town, risking the entrapment of this entire brigade, well, I believe there's 2 brigades of Ukrainian troops that are inside the town. And of course, Ukraine has been trying to redeploy forces, to reinforce positions close to Avdeyevka. The unfortunate 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, the one with the Bradleys and the Leopard 2s, battered and smashed up in the offensive in Zaporozhye over the course of the summer, is now being battered and smashed up even further as its men are thrown into battle close to Avdeyevka itself. And there's lots of reports of Ukrainian counterattacks in this area, trying to roll the Russians back from the various advances that the Russians undertake. But it seems that these counterattacks are mostly unsuccessful, that the Ukrainians suffer heavy losses as they undertake them, that the Russians continue their advances in all of these places, and slowly, steadily, the pincers close, and as the pincers close, the Ukrainians suffer more attrition, suffer more losses of men and machines, without being able ultimately to change the outcome of the battle. So Avdeyevka remains a huge crisis, and one that the Ukrainians don't seem to have an answer for. And the same is starting to happen in Krinky on the Dnieper River. Now, I discussed in the past how the Ukrainians gained the initiative there. They were able to establish this bridgehead in Krinky. But the reality, as it has turned out, has been that this bridgehead that the Ukrainians carved out in Krinky is turning increasingly into another trap for them. They're able to feed men and machines into this bridgehead. The Russian artillery, which in this area includes flamethrower tanks, and the Russian Air Force, with its precision-guided bombs, is able to destroy the Ukrainian reinforcements that arrive in Krinky. Sladko, the governor of Kherson region, said that the life expectancy of a Ukrainian soldier in Krinky is just 2 days. He may be exaggerating, but I've now seen reports that a Ukrainian Marine brigade, one of the brigades that has been concentrated in Kherson region, that has been sending troops into Krinky, they're now also publishing on their own website, the brigade's official website, and apparently it is an actual comment from the brigade, it is not a Russian hack. Anyway, they are complaining of the enormous losses that they're suffering, clinging on to this bridgehead, and they're also complaining of traitors in their midst. They claim that someone is disclosing to the Russians the whereabouts of their forces, and that this is increasing their level of casualties, and that they're demanding that the Ukrainian authorities take steps to investigate and track down this traitor. Well, troops, or so it seems to me, only say these sort of things when things are going incredibly badly, and they clearly are going incredibly badly for the Ukrainians in Krinky. Now, in my last program, I suggested that this sudden collapse in morale that we've seen, not just in Ukraine amongst the military leaders, for people like Zaluzhny and other generals, but also in the media in the West. These articles, for example, like the ones we're seeing in the Wall Street Journal, in the Spectator, they may be the product of the failure, what looks like the looming failure of Ukraine's offensive in Kherson region. I said that it looked to me as if when General Milley met with General Zaluzhny all those months ago, and they agreed to reboot Ukraine's southern offensive, which wasn't going well, that probably a plan for a strike across the Dnieper was part of this reboot. Sladko says, and he may be right, that the original intention was to capture Novaya Kakhovka by the 15th of November, which is of course now passed, and to capture Russia's capital in Zaporozhye, Genishek, by mid-December. That now looks decisively out of reach, and that it's the failure of this part of the counteroffensive, the last remaining flicker of this counteroffensive, which is going to be backed with all those ATACMS missiles and the Storm Shadows, which the Russians have successfully managed to counter. That it is the failure of this part of the counteroffensive that now accounts for this collapse in morale and for Zaluzhny's admission to The Economist that there is not going to be any breakthrough anywhere on the front lines. And I have to say, I increasingly think this. We see Reisner telling us, the Austrian officer telling us, that the time has come to draw the line under the counteroffensive, admit that it has failed. It's clear that he doesn't have any realistic plan for what to do. He accepts that there is now a real possibility that Ukraine as a state is now in jeopardy. And I think Reisner's feelings are privately becoming shared by more and more people, even if they can't openly admit as much. And today we've had the first flicker of admission from no less a person than Zelensky himself. Apparently he's had a meeting with foreign journalists, and Bloomberg quotes him saying that now I'm focused on getting aid from the West. Their focus is shifting because of the Middle East. Without the support, we will move backward. So he's now, even Zelensky is admitting that the counteroffensive is basically ending, and that without Western support, despite all his brave assertions about continuing the war, even if support from the West is running down, that Ukraine is going to be pushed into retreat. Well, there we are. There is no real plan moving forward. As I said, I've now come to the conclusion that there is no political authority in the West, in the United States, in Europe, and of course in Kiev itself, which is capable of conducting negotiations with the Russians. The two articles that I discussed in this program, the one in the Wall Street Journal and the one in the Spectator, which both acknowledge that the war in Ukraine is being lost. They don't come up with solutions to this problem. They engage in more magical thinking. In the one case, talking about containing Russia and accepting that there's not going to be regime change there, and about facilitating Ukraine's entry into Europe, a fantasy if ever there was one. The other talking about mobilizing all the remaining young men left in Ukraine, throwing them into battle without training presumably, and getting the West to send to Ukraine weapons it no longer has. So I think we can now say that policymakers in the West, in the United States, in Europe, though obviously not yet in Ukraine, are now gradually coming to terms with the reality. They're going to have to grapple with that reality very soon. Negotiations are impossible. There's no way that anybody can negotiate with the Russians. There simply isn't the ability, let alone the will, to do that. So no negotiations with the Russians. A military defeat in Ukraine, and the West is going to have to try to grapple with that. I have to say, never can I think of a more dismal outcome to a war. We've discussed on the Duran, I've discussed in this article, how the West sabotaged the peace agreement that Ukraine had almost reached with the Russians in March of last year. I've discussed in many places, as we have also done on the Duran, the long history of negotiations that led up to the war, the Minsk agreement, which was never implemented because Ukraine didn't choose to implement it, and the West quietly and covertly supported Ukraine in its defiance of the Minsk agreement. Ukraine has been led, exactly as Professor Mearsheimer once said, up the primrose path. And it seems to me that it's difficult to see now any outcome other than its eventual collapse. What historians of the future will say, what the families of the people who have died in this war will say, what Ukrainians will feel will say, well, that we will leave to the future. Anyway, let me now turn to other events, and in particular, I want to revisit the topic of the Biden-Xi summit meeting, which has taken place in San Francisco. We see that the Chinese have come away from the meeting having had this 4-hour discussion with President Biden, and they are harping again on what they say President Biden promised to them in Bali at the G20 meeting that took place there. Either last year, and what they say that President Biden reaffirmed in his discussion with Xi Jinping over the course of this meeting in San Francisco. And this is what the Chinese say, what they say about this. They talk about Biden reaffirming the 5 commitments he made in Bali. And the Chinese are now talking increasingly about the 5 no's. The 5 no's that Biden supposedly said to Xi Jinping at the meeting in Bali, and which supposedly he reaffirmed in San Francisco. And the 5 no's are that the United States does not seek a new Cold War, the United States does not seek to change China's political system, the United States does not seek to revitalize its alliances against China, the United States does not support Taiwan independence, the United States has no intention to have a conflict with China. Now, there has been a very good article about the San Francisco summit in the National Interest. As I said, the National Interest, as I said many times, is another one of these heavyweight US journals that cover foreign policy. It's perhaps slightly less authoritative than Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs, but it's up there with those two. And perhaps because it's slightly less authoritative than those other two, it has a little more flexibility in the kind of articles that it covers. Anyway, there's been a fascinating article in National Interest, which does what Western commentary of diplomatic meetings and exchanges very rarely does, but which those of you who follow me know I do regularly, which is pass the readouts that governments give of meetings and sometimes compare the two. And the author of this particular article has done exactly that with the readouts that the Chinese and the Americans published following the meeting in Bali, and the readouts that the Chinese and the Americans published following the meeting in San Francisco. And what the author of this article found is that though the Chinese readout of the Bali meeting refers to the 5 no's, no new Cold War, not seeking to change China's system, not seeking to revitalize alliances against China, no support for Taiwan independence, no intention to have a conflict with China. Though the Chinese talk about these 5 no's, The American readout of the Bali meeting doesn't actually, properly speaking, refer to them. And the Chinese readout of the San Francisco meeting talks about President Biden once again pledging his commitment to the 5 no's of the Bali meeting. And as the National Interest article says, the Chinese are talking about this meeting in San Francisco being essentially an attempt to put things back on track, to follow on from the position of the Bali meeting. In other words, to go back to what was supposedly agreed in Bali, the 5 no's, Biden's 5 no's. Anyway, the author of this article points out that yet again, the American readout shows no sign of Biden doing what the Chinese say he did, reaffirm his commitment to the 5 no's. It talks about entirely different things. The American readouts talk about the same old cliches, reaffirming America's commitments to its values, all those kind of things. And the author of the article makes the absolutely valid and correct point that what this means is that the Chinese, coming away from this meeting with Biden in San Francisco, are saying one thing, and the Americans are saying something completely different. And that tells us that there has been no substantive meeting of the minds about anything. And though it is a fact that this meeting went on for 4 hours, it's worth pointing out that this was not a meeting between the presidents alone. It was not as if Biden and Xi met for 4 hours and conducted an in-depth discussion with each other. This was, as the pictures show, a meeting between 2 very big delegations. And we don't know how much time each president spent speaking. One gets the sense that President Xi actually spoke a great deal. But given the size of the delegations, perhaps it's not so surprising that the meeting did in fact last 4 hours. But the key point is that as there was no meeting of minds, nothing of substance was ultimately agreed. And we can see that the Chinese actually understand this very well. And we've had the inevitable follow-up editorial from Global Times, and it says this: everyone has seen that the journey from Bali to San Francisco was not easy. San Francisco is a new starting point, and the key to the smoothness of the next journey still lies in the implementation of the consensus with the US side. This is the uncertainty that China-US relations cannot avoid, and it largely tests the political credibility of the United States. So the Chinese, Xi Jinping, no doubt, in fact undoubtedly, unquestionably, brought up the topic of the 5 no's with President Biden. President Biden nodded, presumably, and said, yes, I said all of that in Bali, and I, of course, stand by it. But the Chinese have come away saying to themselves, well, he appeared to agree to all of that in Bali, but it didn't really happen. And we aren't, of course, at all confident that it will happen now. Well, I'm going to express my own view, and I think it is also perhaps the view of the author of the article in National Interest. I think this meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, well, it might result in a small upward blip for a short time in US-China relations, but it has the very real potential, ultimately, to make them even worse. The Chinese will have experienced the reality of conducting negotiations with President Biden. President Biden, after the meeting, gave what I think everybody acknowledges was a car crash of a press conference. I touched on it in my program yesterday. He again called Xi Jinping a dictator. He disclosed private, confidential details about negotiations for the release of hostages going on in Gaza. There's film which has been shown around the world of Secretary of State Blinken's expression as the president was conducting the press conference. The press conference had to be ended abruptly to prevent more damage being done. The Chinese will have seen all of that. They will have seen the president himself in action over the course of the summit. They will have heard what Biden said. They will have heard his recommitment or his apparent recommitment to the 5 no's, but they will have no confidence. And this editorial in Global Times says as much. They will have no confidence on the US's ability to follow through with any of that. And they will have gone away back to Beijing. Xi Jinping will no doubt brief the Politburo, the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and probably more foreign policy and political officials in Beijing about those discussions. They will undoubtedly be briefing their friends, the Russians, about what they experienced whilst they were in San Francisco, their impressions of the meeting with Biden. And they will have concluded that there is really no possible way forward with this administration. There's no way that a substantive settlement of the main issues between China and the United States can be achieved with this administration. They will have noted that article by the BBC about how the United States is moving towards a $5 billion aid package for Taiwan. And I suspect that the Chinese are going to respond to what happened in San Francisco by increasing their preparations, upgrading their armed forces, strengthening their army and fleet, sealing more agreements with the Russians for military technology, for food products and energy products and other things, all in preparation for what I am sure the Chinese now will expect will be, beyond a certain point, a further deterioration in relations. The Chinese may hope that beyond the events of San Francisco, beyond this particular administration, they may have a chance of coming to some understanding with any administration that succeeds it. But of course, in the meantime, given the strength of anti-Chinese feeling within the political class in the United States, it is all but inevitable that the Chinese will now intensify their own preparations. So that is my overall view about what happened in San Francisco. a strong, dynamic president, one in full command of the US government, well, the outcome might have been different. But that is not the situation the United States has at the present time. And I think people in the United States are probably becoming more aware of that fact. And Secretary Blinken's expression rather suggested it. Anyway, that's the situation at the moment with the Biden-Xi summit. The Chinese have also been commenting about the UN resolution, the Security Council resolution that was published with respect to the situation in the Middle East, the situation in Gaza. And I have said that, in my opinion, that resolution, quite soft in its language up to this point, that resolution should be seen as a step towards a much stronger resolution, which we are gradually moving towards, which will finally mandate a full ceasefire. And I notice again that the Global Times, again, has now commented on this, and they've made exactly that point. They said the UN Security Council on Wednesday adopted a resolution calling for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors in Gaza. This is the first product of the Security Council on Gaza after the October 7th escalation. The resolution won the support of 12 of the 15 council members, while Britain, Russia, and the US abstained. However, Israel rejected this resolution on Thursday. The resolution constitutes an initial step towards a ceasefire and sends a clear message that the international community strongly opposes all actions suspected of violating the legitimate rights of women, children, and civilians, and contravening international humanitarian law. So China, like Russia, like most of the world, sees this resolution as just one more step in the process, the ongoing process that is coming. I'm going to finish this program by making a brief observation, which is that I think far too many people who engage in commentary underestimate the significance of what happens in the United Nations, of the way in which international diplomacy works, of the way in which diplomatic pressure gradually builds. I think they look for immediate escalation from the other side, Iran in this case, and the other Arab states. They look for oil embargoes and military steps to be taken, which, to be frank, I think would be incredibly dangerous, and which I think all of these countries that people sometimes look to for these kind of actions, all of these countries understand would be incredibly dangerous, first and foremost for themselves, and which, by the way, all of these countries know would play directly into the hands of the hardliners in Washington, people like John Bolton, for example, who would welcome that kind of escalation in order that they can then proceed with the escalation that they plan themselves. Diplomatic pressure of this kind, mobilizing the support of more and more countries, winning over the support of the various international and humanitarian agencies, weakening the political consensus in European states and in the United States itself. And as I've discussed already, in Britain, for example, the opposition Labour Party is now seriously split on this question of a ceasefire. And it seems to me that it is now only a matter of time before Labour in Britain finally comes out in support of a ceasefire, which in turn will put pressure on the British government to support a ceasefire. All of that, by contrast, has a cumulative effect, and as Eli Cohen, the Israeli foreign minister, was quoted in the Financial Times as saying, I believe that over time, before very long, that pressure will have its effect, and we will get, if not perhaps, a declared ceasefire. In effect, the same thing, with an effective end, a cessation of hostilities, which is not far from the situation we're starting to work towards now. So, I just wanted to make that last point. The situation in the Middle East, largely because of the actions of the great powers, of Russia, of China, of Iran and Saudi Arabia, of Egypt as well, has to some extent, at least for the moment, stabilized. It's looking less likely, though it cannot be discounted entirely, that this crisis is going to escalate into some kind of all-out war. The Arab states united against possible steps by the United States to effect such an escalation. They blocked ideas about displacing the entire population of Gaza into the other Arab states. They effectively constrained US attempts to launch an attack on Iran. They've put the United States, and it is the United States that we need to focus upon, diplomatically on the back foot, gradually isolating it in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, and in the Security Council. And overall, bringing this crisis under control. That means that, once again, it is the Ukraine crisis where perhaps the pendulum of seriousness is shifting. The crisis in Ukraine grinds on. The war continues. The Russians continue to make further advances. Ukraine's existence as a state is now starting to be called into question, including by people like Reisner. And in the meantime, the Chinese watch and wait and position themselves with no little skill to benefit from what comes. That, it seems to me, is where we are in international relations at the present time. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, X, also Telegram, BitChute, Rockfin, all of these places. You can also, of course, support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find the links under the video. Don't also forget to check out our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button. And please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me. More from me soon. Have a very good day.